When I tell people I used to be a paranormal investigator, one of two things usually happens. Either the person I'm telling pretty much laughs in my face and scoffs at the idea of ghosts, or the person wants to hear more, and oftentimes asks me, "What was the scariest thing that ever happened to you?" I started hunting ghosts when I was a teenager. I remember from a young age, sitting with my mother in the living room while she watched a man on TV ramble on and on about how he was connected to the afterlife, that he could speak with ghosts, and give people closure from the dearly departed. My mother, of course, would laugh and call it all a load of crap, but my child-sized mind would hang on to every word this man said as if he were communing with the spirits of another world. Eventually, I would grow to realize that, yeah, my mother was right. The man was a fraud, like most of the people who did that sort of thing for publicity. I'm not discounting all psychics or mediums, but I think the ones that do a flashy performance on television are pretty much all talk. Even though the performance was fake, the idea of communicating with the dead was something that appealed to me. It wasn't fully cemented in my life, however, until I watched a man on TV look into a camera and say these words. "Behind me is supposedly the most haunted house in the world. I'm here to find out the truth." Upon saying this, the man entered the dilapidated house behind him and began his investigation. I was utterly captivated by this. I had heard that people would hunt for ghosts, but to see it on actual television was something else entirely. The man proceeded to walk throughout the house, asking questions into the darkness with nothing but a camera and a tape recorder. Sometimes, upon asking a question, a faint noise throughout the house would resonate as if the house itself were a living creature. The next half hour was filled with the man going from room to room asking questions, and nervously glancing at the camera. At the end of the episode, they played back some of the audio they recorded, and the faintest of voices could be heard responding to the man's questions. The chills that went down my spine upon hearing these responses was otherworldly. I knew, at that moment, this was something I wanted to do, just like the man on television. So I did my research. I finished high school. I joined websites and vlogging groups, until I finally earned a place amongst a fairly well-known ghost hunting crew. While we weren't on national television, we did have one of the largest paranormal websites on the internet. For a while, the crew and I would go to mediocre locations near our home studio. A lot of the time, we wouldn't find so much as a cool breeze. Oh, by the way, I hate to break it to you guys, but a lot of those paranormal TV shows are fake as well. You really think that they go to these places and something happens every single time? It doesn't. A lot of the time, you simply waste days sitting in an uneventful house without anything to show for it. But of course, TV is TV, and if they want to doctor up some audio in post-production, even though they say it's unedited, to get a higher rating, they will do it. Now, once again, I'm not discrediting all ghost hunters or paranormal investigators. Usually, the investigators are really good hunters, with really good equipment. But the network bigwigs like to jazz things up to boost their numbers. That's the gist of how I became an investigator. Well, here's the part where I stopped being an investigator. It was early October a few years back when my crew received a tip about a supposedly haunted house in the next state over. We received hundreds of tips every day about go here and check this out. But something about this tip seemed strange. The subject of the email just had a single word: haunted. It may seem childish, but something about reading this solitary word for the email subject almost made me feel like the person sending this had zero doubt that this location was in fact haunted. So I opened the email and read a little bit. The house itself wasn't a very famous haunted house, but it wasn't just a random unknown one either. I had read several other reports regarding this house in the past since it was fairly close to our home studio. Now, how my crew actually handled tips and investigations was a bit odd. The crew was fairly large, and at the risk of wasting time and manpower chasing rumors, we would usually send one investigator and an intern. The team would go scope out the area, sometimes conduct an impromptu investigation on site, then return and determine if it's even worth the time. After taking a vote on who would go this time, I was selected to investigate the location, with the aid of one of our interns. That weekend, the intern and I loaded up my car and we headed out. The intern, John, was a quiet kid, though from his outward appearance it would seem to be the opposite. He was what some people would consider a goth. You would think his reason for joining our crew was to worship the underworld masters, but he confided in me that he always enjoyed creepy things, and that made him somewhat of an outcast in social circles. I was shocked when he spoke to me, because even though his outward appearance was aggressive, he was very soft-spoken and polite. When we arrived at the location, my first impression of the house was not very good. It was an average farmhouse in the middle of a desolate wasteland that was once probably a very successful farm. The rumors that circulated the house ranged from a maniac slaughtering the entire family one night to the daughter losing her mind and murdering her parents. Everything was mostly hearsay, as one day the farm was prosperous, then the following it was left abandoned. John and I entered through the front door, which barely clung to its hinges. As we stepped inside, the smell of rotting wood and dust filled the air. The light from the sun was rapidly leaving the sky as John and I prepared to do our investigation. He handed me a camera and a tape recorder as I began to meander around the house. The fascinating part about being a paranormal investigator is that you get to experience a lot of history. Even though it was just an old farmhouse, I could instantly tell that this house carried with it a lot of memories. As the sun finally set, I asked John which he would rather investigate first, the attic or the basement. His response was a shrug, as he really didn't mind either. I asked if he wouldn't mind checking out the basement while I searched the attic. It's not that I was scared of the basement, I just didn't want to spend the night sitting in an old abandoned basement, that is. He nodded and made his way towards the steps as I made my way to the second floor. As I began traversing from room to room, I asked the occasional question. Is anyone here? What is your name? How old are you? What happened to you? By this point, I had already reached the ladder up to the attic. The attic itself was very underwhelming. A couple of empty wooden boxes, a small chair turned on its side, and a tiny window in the wall. I pulled up the chair and sat down, taking a rest for a bit. While I sat there, I could feel an uneasiness begin to set in. Sometimes when you encounter a spirit, you can feel strange emotions. Well, the feeling I started getting as I sat alone in the darkness was panic. I was feeling like I needed to leave that place immediately. So I got up and I quickly descended the ladder, then the stairs. When I made it to the ground floor, I called out to John. He didn't answer. I called out once again, loudly this time, as I made my way through the kitchen. Still nothing. When I got to the basement door, I called out one last time. Just as I did, the door to the basement slammed in my face. This jolted me, causing me to run all the way out of the house and back to my car. When I was safely in my car, I quickly dialed 911. The police told me that it would take some time to send a unit out to me, but to just sit and wait for them to arrive. When they hung up, I was left in the silence of my car as the color slowly started returning to my face. Just then, I realized I was gripping the tape recorder in my other hand so tightly that I could hear the plastic starting to creak under the pressure. I rewinded the tape and played it back. My voice crackled through the little speaker. Is anyone here? Just then, I heard something. It was faint, barely above a whisper. I had to place my ear directly next to the little box to hear it. Yes. What is your name? John. How old are you? 17. What happened to you? Killed in the basement. Hearing this exchange, The little bit of color that had returned to my face faded once again. Confusion, panic, and fear coursed through me. As I sat there, I heard something else on the recorder. The voice said something at the same time I felt that feeling of panic up in the attic.
Get out. It knows you're here.
I could then hear myself calling out to John, and as I approached the basement, I heard the word,
Don't.
before the basement door slammed in my face. Just then, the police arrived and I explained everything to them. They, of course, searched the entire building from top to bottom, but found no evidence to support my claim. They said the basement was cluttered, but there was no sign of my intern. They took my statement and let me know that they would keep an eye on the area in case John turned up. But somehow I knew that he wouldn't. The next morning, I made my way back home. When I entered the office, I told the rest of the crew what had happened and gave them my recording. I quit immediately after that. As I was leaving the office, I gave them all a final warning. Never go to that house. You may never make it out again, if you do. When I saw the price on the house, I knew there had to be a catch. Listen, I'm not stupid. It's a 2-story Victorian house, well maintained, in a good part of town. There had to be a reason that the price was so low. There was no way the seller was making any profit off of it. And sure enough, the real estate agent that showed me around, Margie Taberworth, was expecting that question. Well, the funny thing is, people around here seem to think that it's haunted. She gave me a nervous laugh when she said that. The kind that tells you that someone's uncomfortable with where the conversation's going. Naturally, I pushed on. So, something awful must have happened here then, to spur these stories. She shifted on her feet and cleared her throat. Well, that's sort of the problem. There are no stories. My left eyebrow almost hit my hairline. Excuse me? The house is, to put it frankly, boring. Nothing of note has happened here. Nobody important has lived here, no deaths to speak of. No legends, nothing. And yet, people have it in their heads that it's haunted. Miss Taberworth sighed and ran a hand through her perfectly straight hair. It's the strangest thing. Most people won't buy the house not because they think it's haunted, but because they constantly have amateur ghost hunters knocking on the door, disturbing them. Some people just have no respect for private property. I'm not sure what reaction Miss Taberworth was expecting from me, but it wasn't the one that she got. I laughed. I laughed so hard I nearly doubled over, hardly able to contain myself. Because that's just perfect, isn't it? A haunted house with no ghosts, no stories. I loved it. I'll take it, I said. And to prove my fortitude in the matter, I signed the papers right then and there. I thought Margie, she asked me to call her that once I asked for the paperwork, was going to have a heart attack. You see, the house was just so perfect for me, exactly where I needed it to be, and just the right size for a single man in his 60s. And besides, some impromptu ghost hunters would certainly keep me entertained. It'd give me a reason to keep the house clean. Heaven forbid I opened my house to paranormal investigators only for them to go around telling everyone I had moldy socks under my couch. So I signed the papers, packed my belongings, and moved in as soon as I could. I was excited to start my new life in such an interesting place. It sure as hell beat a crummy apartment in New York City. For the first few weeks in my new house, I didn't have any visitors. Well, none that were out of the ordinary. I had those regular visits from new neighbors welcoming me to the neighborhood. It's quite a friendly place. And, to be honest, I rather enjoyed everyone I met. Every single person commented on my choice of house. It was all rather amusing to me because they seemed to tiptoe around the subject at first, as though worried they might offend me. But my amusement at my own situation seemed to relax them. A few of them told me the last family to live there had to move out after a few months. It was a young couple and their 3-year-old daughter. Apparently, they couldn't handle all the attention that came with owning such a strange place. I can't really blame them. Having kids in the mix really complicates things. So time went on, and I fit in rather well in the little town. It was just the kind of community that I like. Small and close-knit, but without an inordinate amount of nosiness and gossip. And then, one day, I had a knock at the door. It was a somewhat tall, lanky young man, wearing wire-rimmed glasses. He was so nervous. He stumbled over his words as he tried to tell me why he had come. By the time he managed to stutter out something about ghosts, I was already well ahead of him. "Oh, right. You must be one of those ghost hunters. Come on in." He seemed surprised. Are you sure it's okay? I'm not disturbing you?" "Not at all." I let him in and made some coffee. I brewed mine so dark it stains your guts black if you drink it often enough, and sat and chatted with him for a few minutes. Then I let him wander around the house, taking his pictures, trying his luck at contacting the dead. I wasn't worried, I don't have anything worth stealing anyways, and he was pretty much harmless. After that, my visitors picked up considerably. The young man must have made it known that I was friendly and open to paranormal investigators. During busy times, I'd get at least one visit a week. I enjoyed talking to all different kinds of people who had come by. You'd be surprised how many people like prowling around looking for ghosts. Fashionable young businesswomen, and burly motorcycle gang members, and surprisingly polite teenagers all made appearances. I got along so well with some of them that they visited several times. First for the ghosts, and later to chat with me to see how I was getting along. It was nice, you know. I've never regretted my decision not to marry or have children, but even I do at times get lonely. It's nice to have so many visitors. And besides that, I had never seen any ghosts, or experienced anything strange in the house. I knew for a fact that there was nothing haunted about it at all. Still, I never told anyone that. I let them come in and decide for themselves. Make up their own stories. It's much more fun that way, isn't it? Anyway, none of this ever bothered me or gave me pause. I used to rather enjoy it. And then, one day, something strange happened. It was on a Friday around 4 in the afternoon that 3 ghost hunters appeared on my front step. They were the youngest ghost hunters I had ever seen, and it was clear they had stopped by as soon as school let out. First, there was Sally Thompson from down the road, 9 years old. Then there was Billy Coffey, also 9, whose parents would probably have a fit if they knew he was entertaining thoughts about ghosts. And along with them was another boy, just a tad smaller than the other 2, perhaps 7 or 8, named Darius. Poor kid didn't seem overly fond of that name. I'm still not entirely sure what family he belongs to. Anyway, they informed me rather proudly that they had come to look for ghosts. They'd even made themselves official ghost hunting badges from blue construction paper they had pinned to their clothes. I was impressed. I invited them all in and rummaged around a bit until I found some candy. I didn't have anything else in the kitchen for them, as they all prattled on about how they were going to be the ones to finally prove there was something haunting my house. "I even brought my dad's camera, see?" said Billy. He held up the digital camera proudly. I smiled at them and told them all to have fun. I'll admit that I did follow behind them. Not directly so, but I tried to stay within hearing range of them at all times. Not because I was worried about them taking or breaking anything, but because I didn't want any of them to get hurt. It would have been my problem if one of them had accidentally broken a bone or something. Kids always seem to get into the funniest accidents. My hovering was interrupted by my cell phone. It ended up being somewhat important, otherwise I would have hung up and called back later. While I talked things out on the phone, the children made their way through the house. I eventually heard them descending the stairs, their voices growing fainter. After another few minutes on the phone, I heard a shout from downstairs. "We're leaving!" I think that was Billy. I covered the receiver on the phone and called down. "I hope you kids had fun." "We did. Thanks for letting us look around," called out Sally. That might have been the end of it. Except that little Darius piped up, his voice carrying up the stairs with remarkable clarity. "And thanks for the cookies." I froze at that, confused. I wrapped things up on the phone as quickly as possible and rushed downstairs. The kids were already gone, but the kitchen wasn't empty. Sitting there on the table was a fresh batch of cookies, hot as though they had just come out of the oven, which was stone cold. I'm beginning to think that perhaps there's something in this house after all. Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I had never heard of, but he had an impressive background, and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was back in 2005. I think he might actually have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline, but the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us all hanging on to every word. We all watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up, at a flea market. Just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end of the presentation, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that. And a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed and smiled. "Yes, you, in the white shirt." "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded nervous, because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. "I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter?" I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did. "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh. "There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work." This statement got a little chuckle from the audience. I felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school, and his flashlight failing. I remember because it wasn't particularly scary. At least, it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out of the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey kid," He took another drag and then crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry," I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid kid. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit down. I hesitated for a moment. Then I sat next to him, keeping a healthy distance between us. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older up close, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. The story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career. "I figured that," I remember saying. He nodded as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said. And this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man back then. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually, they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing that there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break that I was searching for. It was the break that I desperately needed. The only detail that truly worried me was about their teenage son. The person they claimed to be suffering from possession had become violent with the members of his family. Up until recently, he had only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he actually attacked one of his older female cousins. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could be all figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating that home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed when in fact, he just seemed to be depressed. Perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended the family a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him to the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they had described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the 1900s, and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved, as it was given necessary updates, like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and, while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the house had been built, and its presence in a residential neighborhood. There was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a faint sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led up to the 2nd floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be emanating from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners, restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just... floating isn't even the right word. Just moving. Moving down the stairs. Straight at me. It had no eyes. It had no face. And yet somehow I knew it was looking at me. Right at me. Into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything. So perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day.
You know what he did to us.
I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted, that it was all hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I had gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by. The accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together. Not necessarily. But I was able to piece some of the meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said, he built his own home/office space. It was a grand feat of architecture, and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs was the bedroom, mid-level the funeral home, in the basement, a mortuary. I then realized what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position, with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all of its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know. I know what he did to them. And it's because of this coming face to face with the true nature of a man in its darkest places. That the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career, because now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice was shaking. I apologized. He waved me off. Then he left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But, as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell to the back of my mind little by little. Until last week, when I moved in with my fiancée. When I took the boxes into the basement despite her warnings of spiders and mold. Because there's a large, slotted drain in the center of the room. And I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know. I'm what you could call a collector of bootleg Pokemon games. Pokemon Diamond and Jade, Chaos Black, etc. It's amazing the frequency with which you can find them at pawn shops, Goodwill, flea markets, and such. They're generally fun, even if they are unplayable, which they often are. The mistranslations and poor quality make them unintentionally humorous. I've been able to find most of the ones that I've played online, but there's one that I haven't seen any mention of. I bought it at a flea market about 5 years ago. Unfortunately, when I moved 2 years ago, I lost the game. The game started with the familiar Nidorino and Gengar intro of the red and blue version. However, the press start screen had been altered. Red was there, but the Pokemon did not cycle through. It also said black version underneath the Pokemon logo. Upon selecting new game, the game started with the Professor Oak speech, and it quickly became evident that the game was essentially Pokemon Red. After selecting your starter, if you looked at your Pokemon, you had, in addition to Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle, another Pokemon, Ghost. The Pokemon was level 1. It had the sprite of the ghosts that are encountered in Lavender Town before obtaining the Sylph Scope. It had only one attack, Curse. I know that there is a real move named Curse, but the attack did not exist in Generation 1, so it appeared to be hacked in. Defending Pokemon were unable to attack Ghost. It would only say that they were too scared to move. When the move Curse was used in battle, the screen would cut to black. The cry of the defending Pokemon could be heard, but it was distorted, played at a much lower pitch than normal. The battle screen would then reappear, and the defending Pokemon would be gone. If used in a battle against a trainer, when the Pokeballs representing their Pokemon would appear in the corner, they would have one fewer Pokeball. The implication was that the Pokemon died. What's even stranger is that after defeating a trainer and seeing Red received $200 for winning, the battle commands would appear again. If you selected Run, the battle would end as it normally does. But you also could select Curse. If you did, upon returning to the overworld, the trainer's sprite would be gone. After leaving and re-entering the area, the spot where the trainer had been would be replaced with a tombstone, like the ones at the Lavender Tower. The move Curse was not usable in all instances. It would fail against ghost Pokemon. It would also fail if it was used against trainers that you would have to face again, such as your rival or Giovanni. It was usable in your final battle against them, however. I figured this was the gimmick of the game, allowing you to use the previously uncapturable ghosts. And because Curse made the game so easy, I essentially used it throughout the whole adventure. The game changed quite a bit after defeating the Elite Four. After viewing the Hall of Fame, which consisted of Ghost and a couple other very underleveled Pokemon, the screen cut to black. A box appeared with the words, "Many years later." It then cut to Lavender Tower. An old man was standing, looking at the tombstones. You then realize that this man was your character. The man only moved at half of your normal walking speed. You no longer had any Pokemon with you, not even Ghost, who up to this point had been impossible to remove from your party through depositing in the PC. The overworld was entirely empty. There were no people at all. There were still the tombstones of the trainers that you used Curse on, however. You could go pretty much anywhere in the overworld at this point, though your movement was limited by the fact that you had no Pokemon to use HMs. And regardless of where you went, the music of Lavender Town continued on an infinite loop. After wandering for a while, I found that if you go through Diglett's cave, one of the cuttable bushes that normally block the path on the other side is no longer there, allowing you to advance and return to Pallet Town. Upon entering your house and going to the exact tile where you start the game, the screen would cut to black. Then a sprite of a Caterpie appeared. It was replaced by a Weedle, and then a Pidgey. I soon realized, as the Pokemon progressed from Rattata to Blastoise, that these were all the Pokemon that I had used Curse on. After the end of my rival's team, a youngster appeared, and then a bug catcher. These were the trainers I had cursed. Throughout the sequence, the Lavender Town music was playing, but it was slowly decreasing in pitch. By the time your rival appeared on screen, it was little more than a demonic rumble. Another cut to black. A few minutes later, the battle screen suddenly appeared. Your trainer's sprite was now that of an old man, the same one as the one who teaches you how to catch Pokemon in Viridian City. Ghost appeared on the other side, along with the words, "Ghost wants to battle." You couldn't use items, and you had no Pokemon. If you tried to run, you couldn't escape. The only option was fight. Using fight would immediately cause you to use struggle, which didn't affect Ghost but did chip off a bit of your own HP. When it was Ghost's turn to attack, it would simply say, ... Eventually, when your HP reached a critical point, Ghost would finally use Curse. The screen cut to black a final time. Regardless of the buttons you pressed, you were permanently stuck in this black screen. At this point, the only thing you could do was turn off the Game Boy. When you played again, New Game was the only option. The game had erased the file. I played through this hacked game many times, and every time the game ended with this sequence. Several times I didn't use Ghost at all, though he was impossible to remove from the party. In these cases, it did not show any Pokemon or trainers and simply cut to the climactic battle with Ghost. I'm not sure what the motives were behind the creator of this hack. It wasn't widely distributed, so it was presumably not for monetary gain. It was very well done for a bootleg, too. It seems that the creator was trying to convey a message, though it seems I am the sole receiver of this message. I'm not entirely sure what it was. The inevitability of death? The pointlessness of it. Perhaps he was trying to morbidly interject death and darkness into a children's game. Regardless, this children's game has made me think, and it has made me afraid. When I was growing up, I always thought life was like a video game. I did everything I could to keep up the illusion. Doing homework was like completing a quest. Talking with friends was like navigating branching dialogue trees with NPCs. And making it to the podium at graduation was like killing the final boss. I kept these fantasies to myself, of course, and didn't think much of them until little details started standing out. Sometimes I'd be walking along a trail in the woods, and my eyes would gravitate towards a tree that looked just a bit blurrier than the others. Other times I'd be talking with my parents and the conversation would seem off, as if their responses were just vague enough to make sense if I had said something else. Mrs. Bainbridge gave us way too much work tonight, I'd argue. Homework is important, son, Dad would say. There's no way I can finish this project on top of baseball practice, I'd yell back. Where there's a will, there's a way, my dad would respond. I grew skeptical. I started testing the universe to make sure it was real. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle that I thought I had solved became detached. One afternoon, I punched my best friend right in the mouth. His face recoiled a bit, but then snapped back into place, his large smile unfazed. Want to play some video games later? He said immediately after, grinning from ear to ear. The next day, I tried to get my parents to say my name. Come down for dinner, honey, Mom called. How was your day, sport? Dad asked. Elbows off the table, dear, my mother replied. This went on for the rest of the night. I couldn't remember the last time my parents ever said my name. Looking back on it, I should have just accepted it. It wasn't hard to live my life as the game intended. I could have been happy had I drowned out all the red flags. It's too late for that now. Yesterday, or at least I think it was yesterday, I decided to push reality to its limits. Right before school, I stole my mom's keys, got in her truck, and drove. It didn't matter where I was going, so long as it was somewhere new. Eventually, the road got less and less familiar. I was entering the wilderness. In a half hour, I had reached the city limits, beyond the thick canopy of trees that isolated our town from the outside world. Except, there was nothing. The road ended there. The land just stopped. Everything was blue. Up, down, and out into the endless expanse. It was all blue. I stood there on the precipice, wondering what my life had been up until that moment. I wondered what it could be. I took my first step into the blue unknown, and I started to fall. In those final seconds, the scariest thing I could imagine was living a life that someone else had chosen for me. But now, I'm still falling. Change is terrifying, especially when you're young. For an 8-year-old boy like me, moving across the country was the biggest change imaginable. When you're young, leaving the few friends that you've made behind feels like the end of the world. I don't remember the move to Gilliman very well. I just remember crying the whole way there. My parents repeatedly tried to console me. They assured me that I would make new friends, and that the town of Gilliman had much better parks and open spaces to play. I refused to listen. Brian, you're gonna love it in Gilliman, I promise. My dad was driving the moving truck we rented. No, I hate Gilliman. I want to go back to Springfield. Oh, Brian, I'm sure you'll love it when we get there. My mother echoed this sentiment. Roger doesn't seem to mind moving, does he, Brian? Of course my younger brother didn't mind moving. He was 4 years old and too young and dumb to understand what was happening. He just sat in the car seat next to me, playing with his little stuffed toy alligator. "Mom, Roger doesn't care because he's still little. If he was my age, he'd want to go back to Springfield too." Roger protested the fact that I called him little, but quickly went back to playing with his toy. I continued to cry and whine for as much of the drive as I could. The drive from Springfield to Gilliland is around 13 hours, so we didn't arrive until it was almost midnight. Another moving truck had already dropped off our beds and moved them inside, so we could go to sleep when we arrived. As angry as I was about the move, I was happy to be able to sleep in my own bed, even if I would have preferred it to be in a different location. I went to bed full of resentment and sadness, directed at my parents, of course. Knowing what I know now, I wish I had appreciated them more. They tried so hard to make me happy. I wish I had been nicer to them and complained less about the move. I wish I had been a better son while I still had the chance. When I think about the fall we moved to Gilliland, I think of what could have been different. That horrible game ruined everything. Sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I grew up in the 90s. The year we moved was 1995. And like every other 8-year-old, I was infatuated with my Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which we called an SNES. I plugged more time into that gaming system than I'm proud to admit. It was truly my prized possession. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the game cartridge that was plugged into the SNES across from my bed. For those of you that remember the Super Nintendo, you might remember that almost every game cartridge was exactly the same. They were all plastic, slate gray cartridges, with black or white stickers on the front. But this one wasn't. It was bright blue, and had a bright red sticker on the front. I didn't recognize it. I had never seen anything quite like it before. I was ecstatic, to say the least. I figured that my parents must have gotten me this game to make me feel better about the move. My reservations about the new house faded away the second I saw that game cartridge. Before I could turn on the SNES, my mom called from downstairs. "Brian, come get your breakfast." Reluctantly, I pulled myself away from the console and wandered into the new kitchen. It was far nicer than the one I had grown up with in Springfield. My mother was standing at the stove, flipping eggs. My father sat at the table, buttering a slice of toast. Roger was planted firmly in his high chair, clutching his alligator toy close to his chest, and spooning oatmeal into his mouth. "Good morning, Brian. Did you find the present Dad and I got for you?" A smile filled my face. "You mean the new game?" "I take it you found it then." "Yes! Thank you so much, it's awesome!" My dad ruffled my hair and motioned at me to sit at the breakfast table. "I'm glad you like it. I got it from my new job. I figured you would enjoy it more than I would." My dad winked at me. He had recently accepted a job as a programmer at a technology company named Kalivaki Electronics. His recent employment had been the reason for our move, so I was certainly happy that I was benefiting from it. Although I was itching to play my new game, my parents made me stay at the table until I had eaten several pancakes and a plate of eggs. When I had a chance, I snuck back up to my room to play the SNES. Up until this point, I hadn't actually had a chance to look closely at the game cartridge. As I said, it had bright coloring, but otherwise it looked like a standard game cartridge. The sticker on the front was red, with bright yellow letters. It read, "Worryland." The letters were superimposed on an image of a cartoonish ray gun, like something Marvin the Martian would have carried. I'm sure that it sounds underwhelming for anyone from the Xbox generation, but I was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. With almost no hesitation, I turned on the console and switched on my small TV. The screen stayed blank for a full 30 seconds, and I was about to turn the console off and try again, when my TV suddenly lit up with bright yellow letters. "Worryland" flashed across the screen. An upbeat 8-bit tune began pouring out of the speakers. Imagine the music from the original Mega Man games. As it beeped and booped, the game shifted into a credit sequence that read, Kalavaki Electronics Company, software like you've never seen before. Like every 8-year-old boy, the thought of playing a new video game was overwhelmingly exciting. That excitement was cut short when a small set of white letters appeared in the top left corner of the screen. You have no worries. Please try again later. I was frustrated. I tried restarting the game several times, but was met with the same result. I pulled the game out of my console and shoved it under my bed. The stupid game didn't even work. I was annoyed with my parents, but I knew it wasn't really their fault. They wouldn't have tested the game or anything. Luckily, I hadn't beaten Mega Man X yet, so I had a different video game to take my mind off of it. I forgot about Worryland. For a while. School started the next morning. I was nervous about going to a new school and starting the 3rd grade. A lot of kids enjoyed the start of school, but I was never one of them. It usually took me a while to make new friends, and I hated how lonely the first few days felt before I had. 3rd grade started worse than I could have imagined. When I was getting off the bus, I tripped and fell off the step. I landed with a thud on the hard sidewalk in front of my school. Beneath me, something cold and wet was soaking into my clothes. I had landed on my bag lunch, which exploded underneath me. As I stood up, I brushed yogurt and a sandwich off my shirt. Then I heard Ryan's laugh. Ryan was an older boy. He was the kind of kid that gets sent to the principal's office once a week, usually for terrorizing some younger kid. Ryan was an asshole. You're supposed to eat your lunch, not wear it. Ryan's childish joke provoked a cluster of laughter from the rest of the kids getting off the bus. I stared at Ryan, who was easily a full foot taller than me, and had at least 60 pounds on me. Aw, are you gonna cry? Ryan teased. As it turned out, I was. I ran towards my new classroom, tears streaming down my face. I spent the first half of my day wiping tears out of my eyes instead of meeting new friends. No one in my class wanted to talk to me since they knew I was the kid who tripped getting off the bus. They knew I was a total loser. To make matters worse, Ryan confirmed any doubts about my unpopularity at recess. As I attempted to climb onto our playground swing set, I heard Ryan's laugh behind me. Look guys, the crybaby is gonna take my swing. Ryan was surrounded by a group of no doubt loyal cronies. They all laughed. It's not your swing. The laughter stopped. Ryan closed the distance between us in a matter of seconds and grabbed me by the collar. What did you just say? He asked between gritted teeth. Nothing, I quivered. Ryan punched me in the stomach. Hard. I began crying again as Ryan let go of my shirt. I ran away from the swing set, back towards the school. For the rest of the day, I hid in the back of the classroom, alternating between crying and trying to look busy. I hated my new school. I hated Ryan. I hated this town. Everything was ruined. When I got home, there was no one there to greet me. My dad was at work, and my mom and Roger were nowhere to be found. There was a note left on the fridge. Brian, went to the store to get groceries. Please do your homework while I'm gone. Mom. The frustration and sadness I had been building throughout the day remained. I retreated to my room, still crying. When I walked inside, I saw the edge of something blue peeking out from underneath my bed. It was my new game, Worryland. The game didn't work the day before, but I felt the need to try it again. Almost without thinking, I removed Mega Man X from the SNES and I plugged in Worryland. The same title screen appeared as last time, and 8-bit music poured through the speakers. But this time, instead of seeing the white text telling me I was worry-free, I heard a voice coming from my TV speakers.
What worries you, child?
The TV screen remained black. I didn't say anything.
Brian, you have to tell me what's wrong.
The game had said my name. I was awestruck with the technology. Clearly, this game was going to be better than I had originally thought. I looked for some cue of what I should do. Hesitantly, I tried responding to the game. I had a bad day at school. There was this bully. His name's Ryan. He hit me. Those were all the words I could muster. The game's screen slowly changed. It became a small, pixelated school building. I could tell it was a school because I could see a school bus through the glass doors on one side of the screen. On the left side, there was a little character. He was wearing a red shirt and blue shorts, but his clothes had stains on them. After a moment, I realized I was wearing a red shirt and blue shorts. They too were stained from when I had fallen on top of my lunch. The little character in the game was supposed to be me. The only difference was that this character had something in his hands. It was a little ray gun from the front of the cartridge. I pressed the directional buttons on the controller, and the character moved accordingly. I navigated the little pixelated version of me throughout the school. After a moment, I came upon two pixelated children. They had speech bubbles over their heads, and their crudely animated mouths were flapping open and shut. The speech bubbles read, "Look at the crybaby. Nice shirt, loser." Reading the text brought back my frustrations. I pushed the X button on my controller, hoping something would happen. It did. The little ray gun that my character was holding fired. A cartoonish laser blast pierced through the kids. Instead of disappearing like in most games, their characters exploded into a gory shower of blood and guts. The gore was surprisingly detailed, especially for a lower resolution game like this. I was a little confused about the objective of the game, but I pressed forward. My character moved through an open doorway onto a playground. The playground hadn't been rendered in much detail, and the only clear piece of equipment was a swing set. In front of the swing set was a little pixelated person. He was taller than my character, and he looked older. This little person also had a speech bubble above his head, but seemed to alternate what it was saying. "This is my swing. Look at the little crybaby. You're supposed to eat your lunch, not wear it." This character was supposed to be Ryan. I had no idea how the game could capture the situation in such detail. I was beginning to feel sick to my stomach. Suddenly, a voice came forward from the speakers once again.
"Brian, don't you want to be worry-free?"
I sat on my bed and stared at the screen. What was this game?
"Brian, press X to end your worries."
I hesitated. This game must have been for an older kid. I was starting to get that nagging feeling, like I was doing something that I wasn't supposed to be. I began to reach for the off switch on the SNES. Then I heard another voice come through my speakers. "Aw, you gonna cry?" It was Ryan's voice. I pressed X. The little ray gun fired, and Ryan's avatar exploded. There was a cartoonish scream, and the same graphic gore exploded on the right side of the screen. The screen went black again. Little white text appeared in the upper left corner of my screen. "You have no worries. Try again later." I went to bed feeling twisted up inside. I felt like throwing up. My dad must have been able to sense my guilt because when he was telling me goodnight, he asked, "Brian, is something wrong?" "No, Dad. I'm just tired." "Okay. You'd tell me if there was something wrong at school, right?" "Yes, Dad." "Okay. Good night, Brian." "Good night, Dad." I didn't see Ryan on the bus the next day. I didn't see any of his friends either. In fact, I never saw Ryan or his friends again. For years, I didn't know what happened to them, but I always felt like it was my fault. I always felt guilty. A couple years later, I looked up Ryan's name from our old school directory. I was trying to find out whether he had moved or had been taken out of school for some reason. I figured that his sudden disappearance was strangely coincidental. All I found was a news article, dated September 1996, almost a full year after I moved. Bodies finally found in missing persons case, September 16th, 1996. After a year of waiting, the bodies of Ryan Ruby, Sam MacLeod, and Ashton Freeber had finally been recovered. The three boys disappeared from their homes on August 26th of last year. There had been no leads as to their whereabouts. All three had a previous history of delinquency and behavior issues, so it was expected that they ran away from home. However, Sheriff Lopez has stated that the three bodies were found near the edge of Gilliman Reservoir several days ago. They were identified by their school IDs, which were found in their pockets. Sam MacLeod and Ashton Freeber were both found fully intact, save for minor cuts and bruises. Ryan Ruby's body, however, was found severely mutilated and dismembered. All three appeared to have been shot in the head. The investigation into their disappearance has been reopened. All three families have declined to comment at this time. August 26th was the first day of school. That was the day I played Worryland for the first time. After that, I could barely bring myself to look at it, let alone play it again. I buried it beneath my bed and quickly pushed it out of my mind. I wish I could say that was the only time that someone played Worryland. But that isn't the case. My mom was out of town at the time, so my dad was the only one in charge at our house. My dad was a good man, but wasn't an expert when it came to child caring. He wasn't as patient with Roger or I as my mom was. One night, Roger and I were acting particularly unruly. Roger had refused to eat his dinner. Dad had made spinach, which was something Roger particularly hated. Dad had grown tired of arguing with my 4-year-old brother. He grabbed Roger's alligator toy and told him, "I'm taking this away. You can have it back when you eat your dinner." Roger, only being 4 years old, didn't fully understand why his favorite toy was being confiscated. He immediately burst into tears, and the second my dad turned around, he fled the room. The phone began ringing, and my dad picked it up off the hook. He motioned for me to go get Roger. I followed Roger out of the kitchen and turned the corner just in time to see him reach the top of the stairs and run into my room. The only reason Roger ever went into my room was to play the SNES. He wasn't any good at it, but I think he liked the music and the colors. I called after him. "Roger, you have to come eat dinner. You can't play video games right now." There was no response. I heard my door slam shut and lock. "Come on, Roger. Just eat your dinner and I'm sure Dad will give you back your alligator." As I approached the door, I heard a familiar 8-bit theme begin playing. I struggled to place exactly what the music was as I fumbled with the locked doorknob. Then I heard a voice.
What worries you, child?
In a panic, I began pulling at my door. I tried and tried to force it open, but it was too strong for my 8-year-old body. I heard Roger answer, "My dad is being mean." I listened intently as the game's music quieted. I heard Roger pressing buttons. I heard my dad's voice come from downstairs as he talked on the phone. I heard the game speak again. It was calm and even, almost peaceful.
Press X to end your worries.
Panic flooded my brain. I screamed for Roger not to press X. I screamed for my dad to stop talking on the phone. I was too late. A cartoonish scream came from my room, a real one from the kitchen. I ran downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The phone, which had been in my dad's ear just a second before, was lying coldly on the ground. A dial tone poured out of the receiver. The back door was open. They never found my dad's body. I'm not sure that I want them to. I don't think I want to know what happened to him. Ever since then, it's just been me, my mom, and Roger. We stayed in Gilman, but we had to move to a much smaller house since my dad wasn't around anymore. A couple years later, my mom ended up selling my Super Nintendo and all my games, including Worryland. We needed the money to make ends meet. And besides, I didn't really want to play video games anymore. They made me feel sick. Still, I wonder sometimes who has that game. I wonder if they've played it yet. I hope to God that if they did, they were worry-free. I first met in person with Mary E. in the summer of 2007. I had arranged with her husband of 15 years, Terrence, to see her for an interview. Mary had initially agreed, since I was not a newsman but rather an amateur writer gathering information, for a few early college assignments, and, if all went according to plan, some pieces of fiction. We scheduled the interview for a particular weekend when I was in Chicago on unrelated business. But at the last moment, Mary changed her mind and locked herself in the couple's bedroom, refusing to meet with me. For half an hour, I sat with Terrence as we camped outside the bedroom door. I listened and took notes while he attempted fruitlessly to calm his wife. The things Mary said made little sense, but fit with the patterns I was expecting. Though I could not see her, I could tell from her voice that she was crying, and more often than not, her objections to speaking with me centered around an incoherent diatribe on her dreams. Her nightmares. Terrence apologized profusely when we ceased the exercise, and I did my best to take it in stride. Recall that I wasn't a reporter in search of a story, but merely a curious young man in search of information. Besides, I thought at the time I could perhaps find another, similar case, if I put my mind and resources to it. Mary E. was the sysop for a small Chicago-based bulletin board system in 1992, when she first encountered Smile.jpg, and her life changed forever. She and Terrence had only been married for about 5 months. Mary was one of an estimated 400 people who saw the image when it was posted as a hyperlink on the BBS. Though she is the only one who has spoken openly about the experience, the rest have remained anonymous, or are perhaps dead. In 2005, when I was only in the 10th grade, Smile.jpg was first brought to my attention by my burgeoning interest in web-based phenomena. Mary was the most often cited victim of what is sometimes referred to as Smile.dog, the being Smile.jpg is reputed to display. What caught my interest, other than the obvious macabre elements of the cyber legend and my proclivity towards such things, was the sheer lack of information, usually to the point that people don't believe it even exists, other than as a rumor or a hoax. It is unique because, though the entire phenomenon centers on a picture file, that file is nowhere to be found on the internet. Certainly, many photo-manipulated simulacra litter the web, showing up with the most frequency on such sites as the image board 4chan, particularly the X-focused paranormal subboard. It is suspected that these are fakes because they do not have the effect that the true file is believed to have. Namely, sudden onset temporal lobe epilepsy and acute anxiety. This purported reaction in the viewer is one of the reasons the phantom-like Smile.jpg is regarded with such disdain. Since it is patently absurd, though depending on whom you ask, the reluctance to acknowledge Smile.jpg's existence might be just as much out of fear as it is out of disbelief. Neither Smile.jpg nor Smile.dog is mentioned anywhere on Wikipedia, though the website features articles on other such, perhaps more scandalous shock sites. Any attempt to create a page pertaining to Smile.jpg is summarily deleted, by any of the encyclopedia's many admins. Encounters with Smile.jpg are the stuff of internet legend. Mary E's story is not unique. There are unverified rumors of Smile.jpg showing up in the early days of Usenet, and even one persistent tale that in 2002, a hacker flooded the forums of humor and satire website Something Awful with a deluge of Smile.dog pictures, rendering almost half of the forum's users at the time epileptic. It is also said that in the mid to late 90s that Smile.jpg circulated on Usenet, and as an attachment of a chain email with the subject line, "Smile, God loves you." Yet, despite the huge exposure these stunts would generate, there are very few people who admit to having experienced any of them, and no trace of the file or any link has ever been discovered. Those who claim to have seen Smile.jpg often weakly joke that they were far too busy to save a copy of the picture to their hard drive. However, all alleged victims offer the same description of the photo: a dog-like creature, usually described as appearing similar to a Siberian husky, illuminated by the flash of a camera, sits in a dim room. The only background detail that is visible being a human hand extending from the darkness near the left side of the frame. The hand is empty, but is usually described as beckoning. Of course, most attention is given to the dog, or dog creature, as some victims are more certain than others about what they claim to have seen. The muzzle of the beast is reportedly split in a wide grin, revealing 2 rows of very white, very straight, very sharp, very human-looking teeth. This is, of course, not a description given immediately after viewing the picture, but rather a recollection of the victims, who claim to have seen the picture endlessly repeated in their mind's eye during the time they are, in reality, having epileptic fits. These fits are reported to continue indeterminably, often while the victims sleep, resulting in very vivid and very disturbing nightmares. These may be treated with medication, though in some cases it is more effective than others. Mary E., I assumed, was not on effective medication. That is why after my visit to her apartment in 2007, I sent out feelers to several folklore and urban legend-oriented news groups, websites, and mailing lists, hoping to find the name of a supposed victim of Smile.jpg who felt more interested in talking about his experiences. For a time, nothing happened, and at length I completely forgot about my pursuits, since I had begun my freshman year of college and was quite busy. Mary contacted me via email, however, near the beginning of March 2008.
Dear Mr. L, I'm incredibly sorry about my behavior last summer when you came to interview me. I hope you understand that it was no fault of yours, but rather my own problems that led me to act out as I did. I realized that I could have handled the situation more decorously. However, I hope you will forgive me. At the time, I was afraid. You see, for 15 years I've been haunted by Smile.jpg. Smile.dog comes to me in my sleep every night. I know that sounds silly, but it's true. There is an ineffable quality about my dreams, my nightmares, that makes them completely unlike any real dreams I've ever had. I do not move, and I do not speak. I simply look ahead, and the only thing ahead of me is the scene from that horrible picture. I see the beckoning hand, and I see Smile.dog. It talks to me. It's not a dog, of course, though I'm not quite sure what it really is. It tells me that it will leave me alone if only I do what it asks. All I must do, it says, is spread the word. That is how it phrases its demands. And I know exactly what it means. It wants me to show it to someone else. And I could. The week after my incident, I received in the mail a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was only a 3.5-inch floppy diskette. Without having to check, I knew precisely what was on it. I thought for a long time about my options. I could show it to a stranger, a coworker. I could even show it to Terrence, as much as the idea disgusted me. And what would happen then? Well, if Smile.Dog kept its word, I could sleep. Yet if it lied, what would I do? And who was to say that something worse wouldn't come for me if I did as the creature asked? So I did nothing for 15 years, though I kept the diskette hidden among my things. Every night for 15 years, Smile.Dog has come to me in my sleep and demanded that I spread the word. For 15 years I have stood strong, though there have been hard times. Many of my fellow victims on the BBS board where I first encountered Smile.jpg stopped posting. I heard some of them committed suicide. Others remained completely silent, simply disappearing off the face of the web. They are the ones I worry about the most. I sincerely hope you will forgive me, Mr. L. But last summer, when you contacted me and my husband about an interview, I was near the breaking point. I decided I was going to give you the floppy diskette. I didn't care if Smile.Dog was lying or not. I wanted it to end. You were a stranger, someone I had no connection with. And I thought I wouldn't feel any sorrow when you took the diskette as part of your research and sealed your own fate. Before you arrived, I realized what I was doing. I was plotting to ruin your life. I couldn't stand the thought. In fact, I still can't. I'm ashamed, Mr. L. And I hope that this warning will dissuade you from any further investigation of Smile.jpg. You may in time encounter someone who is, if not weaker than I, then wholly more depraved. Someone who will not hesitate to follow Smile.Dog's orders. Stop, while you're still whole. Sincerely, Mary E.
Terrence contacted me later that month with the news that his wife had killed herself while cleaning up various things she'd left behind, closing email accounts and the like. He happened upon the above message. He was a man in shambles. He wept as he told me to listen to his wife's advice. He had found the diskette, he revealed, and burned it until it was nothing but a stinking pile of blackened plastic. The part that most disturbed him, however, was how the disc had hissed as it melted. Like some sort of animal, he said. I will admit that I was a little uncertain about how to respond to this. At first, I thought perhaps it was a joke, with the couple belatedly playing with the situation in order to get a rise out of me. A quick check of several Chicago newspapers' online obituaries, however, proved that Mary E. was in fact deceased. There was, of course, no mention of how she died in the article. I decided that, for a time at least, I would not further pursue the subject of Smile.jpg, especially since I had finals coming up at the end of May. But the world has odd ways of testing us. Almost a full year after I had returned from my disastrous interview with Mary E., I received another email.
Hello. I found your email address through a mailing list. Your profile said you are interested in Smile.Dog. I have seen it. It is not as bad as everyone says. I have sent it to you here. Just spreading the word.
The final line chilled me to the bone. According to my email client, there was one file attachment called, naturally, Smile.jpg. I considered downloading it for some time. It was most likely a fake, I imagined. And even if it weren't, I was never wholly convinced of Smile.jpg's peculiar powers. Mary E.'s account had shaken me, yes, but she was probably mentally unbalanced anyway. After all, how could a simple image do what Smile.jpg was said to accomplish? What sort of creature was it that it could break one's mind with only the power of the eye? If I downloaded the image, if I looked at it, and if Mary turned out to be correct, if Smile.dog came to me in my dreams demanding I spread the word, what would I do? Would I live my life as Mary had, fighting against the urge to give in until I died? Or would I simply spread the word, eager to be put to rest? And if I chose the latter route, how could I do it? Whom would I burden in turn? If I went through with my earlier intention of writing a short article about Smile.jpg, I decided I could attach it as evidence. And anyone who read the article, anyone who took interest, would be affected. And even assuming the Smile.jpg attached to the email was genuine, would I be capricious enough to save myself in that manner? Could I really spread the word? Yes. Yes, I could. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange, human-looking creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remained powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. A suicide note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him, for once I awoke and I felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake again. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Linny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. A journal entry translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. The journal entry ends there. A mariner's log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again. at the request of the Rake. Next is an account from a witness in 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my wife and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my wife had gotten up to use the restroom. I used that moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake her in the process. I apologized and told her that I thought she had gotten out of bed. When she turned to face me, she gasped and pulled her feet up from the end of the bed so quickly her knee almost knocked me out of the bed. She then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large, hairless dog of some kind. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help it. My wife was peering over her arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed, until it was less than a foot from my wife's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, or probably closer to 5, it just seemed like a while, just staring at my wife. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway, leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my kids. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched over about 20 feet away. It turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped on the switch in the hallway and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs, while my wife and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her life. She said, "He is the Rake." My wife drove her car into a lake that night, while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a very similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now referred to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, and never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. Doing this still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my wife. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that very moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I will wake up and see him staring at me in the dark. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake, so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, running water, and a toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test, and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began whispering into the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about his behavior is how the other captives reacted to it. Or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming then promptly stopped. So did the whispering in the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at very heavy levels of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced,
"We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom."
To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice respond, "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out amongst the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightfully call the state that any of them were in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest, stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that had been ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber, and begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative, and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arms of one of the doctors. His heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out, to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach, and just repeating one word: "More," over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room in the facility. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given him to prepare him for surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding his wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and shut, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to the skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, that they try the surgery without anesthetic, and the subject did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, and the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be of some drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. 2 words. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subject could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds again. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given. I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatline inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on papers scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwave showed the same flatlines as the one who just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject. and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. "So nearly free." Today, my friends and I started celebrating the Halloween season by going to a haunted farm off in the outskirts of town. I use the term haunted loosely because this place is just a really scaled down theme park that's been in the region for over 20 years. I don't scare easily, so I wasn't expecting much from the visit aside from a bit of lighthearted fun with friends. Who would have thought that after an evening of cheap jump scares and screaming mostly to be polite, I'd find myself sitting in my bed, genuinely shaking in fear? I certainly didn't, yet here I am. All because some thing followed me home. Whenever a car drives down the street, I catch glimpses of it slowly crawling down my neighbor's house and towards mine, as though toying with me. It all happened because of that damn farm. We arrived at the farm late in the afternoon. It was nice out. Not too hot, not too cold. The farm was pretty neat, though it wasn't overly spooky looking in the daylight. They had built a few old Wild West-style houses they had decorated with pumpkins and giant spiders, had a few creepy mascots walking around, and sprinkled demonic baby dolls where they saw fit. In the daytime, this place was a playground for kids. I saw more bouncy houses and face painting stations than scary attractions, but I expected things would change once the sun went down. My friends and I headed out to do the corn maze while they were still open, and then headed to the food trucks for dinner. By the time we were done eating, it was finally dark out, and the toddlers had sprouted into teenagers. As expected, the park indeed looked a lot creepier at night. They had turned on their fog machines and colored lights to give the place a surreal atmosphere. The mascots had changed their makeup from sort of menacing but still friendly to sort of demonic, with a few vampires and masked witches thrown in for good measure. It was fine. Not all that scary, though. I'm not trying to make myself out to be some unshakable badass or anything, but I honestly don't scare all that easily. I'm not really susceptible to things I know aren't real. Creepy music and plastic hatchets just don't work on me. You could blame my time hanging around the creepy part of the internet for my desensitization, but the truth is, I've always been pretty numb to horror. I'm more afraid of practical things, like being stuck in a line for a haunted hayride for half an hour with a bunch of rowdy 13-year-old kids, screaming profanities to try and outshock one another. Then there's splinters, and disgusting porta potties, the first and last of which I experienced at the farm. Ugh. My friends and I walked around and tried out the different attractions. We did the aforementioned hayride, the witch's coven, and the demonic funhouse, which was fun for all the wrong reasons. See, the funhouse was pretty tame, all things considered. You walk your way through the world's most straightforward maze, and from time to time, a creepy clown appears out of nowhere and kind of shuffles behind you and follows you for a bit. I can see how that might be a bit unsettling to kids, but these clowns were all actors, and they weren't allowed to actually touch anyone, so there really wasn't anything to be afraid of. That didn't stop this one chick from breaking down outside the attraction, however. This 20-something gal totally lost it. She was sobbing into her boyfriend's arms, and I couldn't help but laugh as we walked past her. Sorry, but if you can't handle a clown standing next to you for half a second, maybe you shouldn't be going into a demonic funhouse. Just saying. Check yourself before you emotionally wreck yourself. It was getting late, and we still had one major attraction to go. According to our map, it was the scariest of them all. 4 chainsaws out of 4. Having heard screams of abject terror coming from that side of the park, I was really looking forward to seeing what all the fuss was about. Along the way, my friend pointed out a cemetery with a half-opened gate and not a soul in line to go in. There had been a 30-minute wait for all the other attractions, but this one was as still as a grave. Pun intended. "Should we go in?" she asked. "Might as well," I replied. The gate squealed as we opened it the rest of the way. Oh boy. It appeared as though someone had left the fog machine on overnight. The curtains of smoke were so thick I couldn't even see my own feet. I grabbed the friend behind and in front of me just so we wouldn't lose one another in the mist. That's how dense it was. I didn't really like the cemetery. For one thing, there wasn't much to it. A few tombstones here and there, a crypt, some gargoyles. But overall, it was just annoying. I kept tripping on exposed tree roots and fake plastic bones. It was a pain in the ass. But it was worth it for the one genuine scare I got all night. As I was turning a corner, I felt something grab my leg. I let out my only authentic scream all evening because I had no idea we weren't alone in the cemetery. The fog had done a great job of hiding this guy in a pitch-black morph suit crawling around on all fours. I only saw him because as I screamed, I also flapped my arms around like a drunk duck trying to take off, and the motion dispersed the fog for a second. The guy crawled away and disappeared behind a tombstone. My friends laughed and laughed and laughed. Whatever, I mumbled. Wasn't even that scary. We found our way out of the cemetery after that, and headed to the main attraction. The wait was longer than any other attraction at the farm, because it was allegedly the scariest of them all. The cream of the crop. Hell, after the scare I had gotten at the cemetery, my expectations were pretty high for this one. And, it was fine. I mean, there were guys in pretty realistic pig masks running after us with chainsaws, but even in the dark, I could tell the blades weren't actually moving. I didn't feel like I was in danger. Well, aside from the very real danger of possibly losing all blood circulation in my arm, when one pig man jumped in front of us, and my friend grabbed me so tightly my fingers went numb. She screamed. I just kind of stared at the pig man, unfazed. I half expected him to tell me to feed the pig. Not tonight, buddy. Not tonight. We drove home after that and chatted about our favorite parts of the night. "You got so scared in the cemetery," taunted Jules. I huffed. "That dude just startled me is all." The car went silent. "What guy?" someone in the back seat asked. "The dude in the morph suit," I answered. "Huh?" "He was crawling on the ground." "I didn't see him." I shrugged. "It was foggy. You probably missed him." We all went back to chatting. Eventually, I dropped everyone off at their places. I wasn't too tired by the time I got home. So I booted up my computer and uploaded the photos we had taken that night. Everything was pretty normal. Until we got to the cemetery. Or rather, after the cemetery. The morph suit guy was in the background of all the other photos I took, which was really strange to me, since I thought the mascots were supposed to stay in their attractions. They had these lame bios for their mascots on the website, so I looked him up just to see. He wasn't listed anywhere. I felt a small knot in my stomach, but eventually laughed it off. There were plenty of guests in costumes. Maybe this was an annoying teenager having fun. At this point, I thought I could hear a squirrel or something scratching at my bedroom window, but I couldn't spare a glance. I was too busy staring dumbfounded at the website. I had clicked on the venue map link. I noticed the distinct lack of a cemetery on the map. The thought did occur to me that this was all intentional on part of the people who were running the farm. A great way to get one last scare out of their guests, after they had gone home. It was as easy as not drawing a cemetery on their little cartoon map. As simple as not including it on the list of attractions. As easy as omitting one spooky mascot from their character bios. I wish that were the case. I wish that, when I looked out the window, I hadn't seen the figure in the morph suit staring back at me, and then quickly skittering backwards across the yard and up to my neighbor's roof. I wish he had stopped crawling nearer whenever I blink or look away. Every time I focus on my screen to write another line, I catch him in my peripheral vision. He's at the window right now. I give him a quick glance. He runs away. I can't help but worry what'll happen when I close my eyes and fall asleep. I think I'll find that out soon though, because I'm just so tired now, and I can't seem to keep my eyes open much longer. I used to own a small Halloween-themed shop. It's located downtown in a fairly small city, and unlike many businesses in town after Walmart's arrival, my store never really suffered when it came to customers. Of course, it was only open for the month of October. I sold a lot of unique things you might find at other novelty stores in bigger cities, but for cheaper prices. I really didn't do it for profit as much as I did it to celebrate the spooky Halloween spirit. I also love to celebrate that spirit by doing my best to scare the crap out of people every Halloween. One particular Halloween, my chosen victim was my buddy Alex. He was a pretty relaxed and calm guy most of the time, so he was the perfect person for the plan I had in mind. First, you should know that I always begin packing my store up every Halloween fairly early in the morning, as it was unlikely to get customers on the holiday itself. I had told Alex that I had much heavier merchandise that year and could use the help moving it all out. Not knowing what he was getting himself into, he accepted. And I told him to meet me at my shop at 10 at night, sharp. As I said before, Alex was a relaxed and calm guy most of the time. Unfortunately for him, he had once told me about his irrational fear of clowns, and how he could not function around them. So naturally, my plan involved dressing up in a clown costume. When he arrived at the shop, I would stand perfectly still like a statue. Once he realized he couldn't find me, he would then probably try to call me, most likely. But when my phone rang, it would be in the pocket of an apparent clown statue. And when he would come over to investigate, I'd give him my best scare. Pretty simple plan, right? Everything was in motion. I dressed up, stood near the back of the store obscured by some boxes and other decorations, and waited for his arrival. A little after 10, Alex entered. It was very dark, as I had made the last-minute decision to cut the lights before he arrived. He called my name a few times, but of course I didn't respond. I heard him walking around a bit, looking around the shop for me. I could barely hold back my laughter. After a bit more shuffling, I heard Alex speak in a defensive tone. Not funny, dude. I looked around, but there was definitely no way he could see me right now, even if I had twitched or something. I continued to play dumb. Come on, man, he repeated again, sounding angrier this time. That's not funny. Confused, I quickly adjusted a nearby stack of boxes so I could peer through a crack towards his voice. I couldn't make out his shape very well, but I knew for sure he was not looking in my direction. Suddenly, my phone rang. I heard Alex turn towards the sound instantly and I froze, giddy with excitement that the plan might be working. But as he approached, I realized he wasn't holding his phone, and a wave of disappointment fell over me as I discovered my prank had been ruined by another caller. Alright, fine, you got me, I announced shortly after my phone stopped ringing, taking off my mask and stepping out into the open. But Alex's face didn't look relieved. His face twisted in such horror that I had never seen before. He began yelling and spouting panicky words, and I spent a few minutes trying to get him to calm down. He explained to me that when he entered, a man in a clown costume had stared at him and began walking slowly towards him. But when my phone rang, the man had dashed right out of the store. Alex had no idea that I was actually hiding in the back the whole time. I don't want to think about what would have happened if Alex had showed up late that night, or if my other buddy had never called during the prank. I had what many people would call a warped childhood. Many children are raised on nursery rhymes, fairy tales, and Dr. Seuss. And while my childhood did have these memories, my mother included another genre in mine and my sister's upbringing: horror. I cannot count the number of times when my sister and I were read some of Stephen King's short stories for bedtime, rather than a more common children's story. I grew up watching the classic horror movies and being told ghost stories. Many people, when I tell them this, ask me if I had a lot of nightmares as a child, as a result. But the truth is quite the opposite. I was not afraid of the boogeyman or ghosts. To me, ghosts and goblins were simply fictional creatures that are only in books, movies, and in stories told around the campfire. The horror genre was simply a part of my life. I loved the feeling of being scared. So, naturally, Halloween was one of my favorite times of the year. I remember one Halloween many years ago. I was young, but not so young that I don't have first-hand memories of the events soon to follow. There was a Halloween attraction that was running just down the street from our house. It had been going on every Halloween for a few years, but my parents had never let my sister and I go before. And then, one year, we were finally given permission to go to this haunted attraction. The attraction was built into an old abandoned manor house, just the sort of place where you would expect a Halloween attraction to be built. I remember being very excited as I waited to get into the house, because lots of people that were coming out were raving about how scary it was, and I was highly anticipating having my own time inside. Like most Halloween attractions, they let people inside the house in small groups. Because my sister and I were only children, the attendants at the door made sure that we were put in the same group as our parents. Finally, we stepped inside. Inside, it could have been any haunted house in America in the 90s. Full of fog and grease-painted actors. I wasn't overly scared, because my mother always reminded me that the actors were not allowed to touch you. But I still jumped and screamed along with everyone else when a monster jumped out of the hidden nooks and crannies of the old manor house. Eventually, we made our way down into the basement, which had been changed into the stereotypical mad doctor setting common in a lot of haunted houses. Needless to say, there was a lot of fake blood everywhere. But I'll never forget that basement, because something just seemed a little out of place. Sometimes, even the most normal things can become diabolical if you alter the perspective. It's something you see in a few modern ghost hunting shows and B-shots. There was nothing that immediately jumped out as being evil. There was certainly nothing like The Exorcist happening to tip me off that something was wrong. It was a simple sight, but that made it much more unnerving because it stood out against the overt horror backdrop of the decorated room. In the midst of the bloody carnage of the mad doctor's operating room, I saw an old woman was sitting in the far corner of the room. She looked to be in her 80s, had thinning gray hair, and was very emaciated. I would be lying to myself if I said she didn't scare me more than the rest of the attraction combined. At the time, I didn't have much understanding of the effects the different physical ailments can have on a person. But looking back on it now, I would say that she was the victim of a very bad stroke. Sometimes a bad stroke will leave the person with one side of his or her face paralyzed. And that's exactly what she looked like. One side of her face was drooping and saliva was leaking out of the corner of her mouth. She was talking, yelling at us as we passed by. Her words were badly slurred because of her paralyzed face, but I could just barely make out what she was yelling. Stop! Get out! Over and over again. Even passing through the basement and going out the other side. I could still hear her screaming in that awful slurred way up the stairs. I was extremely disturbed by the sight of this old woman, but as I got away from her, I began to feel better. She was obviously an actor who was working for the attraction. Most of the attraction workers worked on jump scares, and she was obviously there to cater more to the psychological horror. Well, in any case, it worked. Certainly worked on me. We emerged out into the night once again and got that instant sense of relief that makes horror so addicting. The "we have survived" moment. My sister instantly began to talk about which part was her favorite. An actor who had jumped out at her in a werewolf costume had been her favorite. When it came my turn to share, I could think of nothing else besides the old woman I had seen, and I told my family about how the old woman in the basement had scared me the most. "What woman in the basement?" my mother asked. Surprised, I began to describe as best I could what I had seen. When I finished, my mother said that she hadn't seen any woman fitting that description down in the basement. The rest of my family agreed with her. I put the incident out of my mind. Like I said, I didn't believe in ghosts and certainly didn't believe that they were real. I tried to rationalize why they had missed the old woman and her screams. Each attempt to do this was more pathetic than the last. But I knew that ghosts couldn't be real. The next year, I was eager to step foot into the old manor again. But I was horrified to discover that the haunted attraction had been shut down and would not be opening again. Since I lived so close to the building, a few people in my neighborhood had taken up jobs there, and I had asked around about why it had closed. The few people that would talk to me told me that the old manor house was actually haunted, with real ghosts, and that too many people were refusing to work there again because of the paranormal activity going on there. Their stories ranged from objects moving on their own to apparitions, and even to physical attacks against the living that entered certain parts of the house. I laughed it off. People were just letting the atmosphere of Halloween mess with them. It was probably just a couple of teenagers messing with the workers. But no matter how hard I tried to explain to the workers about how it could be a couple of jokers messing around, they kept insisting that it was impossible for it to have been any human activity. But even as I tried to convince them, I couldn't help but remember the old woman that I had seen in the basement. The one that no one else had seen. I was kind of nervous about the whole thing, and I wanted more information about the house. These days, you can look up anything on the internet and have an answer in seconds. But the 90s was not like that. Few people had internet at the time, and my family was one that did not have internet access. So I went to the next best thing. My mother. I asked her about the old manor house. At first, she was reluctant to tell me, which kind of bothered me, because she had never shied away from telling us things of that nature before. Finally, after a few tries, she told me what she knew. The manor started out as a private residence built in 1922, but the original owner lost the house in foreclosure. After that, it became a sanitarium, which is something like a small hospital. Just by virtue of being a hospital in the area where it was the only hospital around at the time, a lot of people passed away within the walls. In fact, there are some reports that say there was at least one death a day within those walls during this time. But that was not even the part that my mother was reluctant to tell me. She told me that afterwards, it was turned into a nursing facility, and they would have taken care of sick, elderly people just like the old woman I had seen during my walk through. But the records of abuse that came out of that place is numerous. Many ex-employees confess that they quit soon after being hired because of the vast amount of malpractice that happened there. My mother remembered all this because it was in the newspapers when it was going on. It was a huge deal in the community. It made me feel a little sick to think about how those people, those human beings, were treated in that horrible place. And that's not all. Local legend has it that the building was haunted by the tortured souls of the people who died under the horrible conditions there. The man who built the Halloween attraction there knew of the history and the legends surrounding the place, and built the attraction with the sole purpose of profiting off of these stories. And it was then that I realized I had seen the ghost of a woman who had died in the building. She just wanted to spend her afterlife in peace. But instead, every year, her and her fellow ghosts were interrupted by the living, storming through their place in the thousands, turning their entire situation into a joke. And, for the first time ever, I began to treat ghosts and spirits not as fictional creatures only meant to frighten and scare, but as real physical manifestations of a force that humans are not capable of understanding yet. The house, to this day, continues to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. The owner lets in a local paranormal group at least once a week, every Friday night, to do an investigation. Several ghost-themed television shows have filmed at the location. One show even brought in a psychic medium, who claims that the years the house spent as a Halloween attraction has forever scarred the house, and the spirits who reside there. One thing is for sure, I'm now a lot more careful about checking out the history of any Halloween attraction I go to. Ghosts are everywhere, of course, but I'll never go to a place with such a sad history attached to it again. I haven't been able to get scared inside a Halloween attraction since then anyways. I don't scream, jump, or run away as the actors jump out at me. Nearly all of my friends have commented on my bravery in the face of these Halloween attractions. But I don't think I'm brave. Not really, anyway. It's just a lack of fear. Because it's hard to get scared by actors in makeup when you've experienced the real thing. Halloween. It's that time of year where the paranormal becomes normal, where the ghosts, ghouls, and goblins come out to wreak havoc upon the neighborhoods. It used to be my favorite time of the year. Growing up, I absolutely adored Halloween. It was a holiday that truly catered to children. Yes, on Christmas, children would collect presents, and on Easter, egg hunts were always a fun activity. But there was just something about Halloween that evoked an almost primal excitement in children. The act of dressing up as your favorite character or monster, then prowling the streets collecting free candy. What's not to love, am I right? When I was a kid, there wasn't anything better in the entire world. I was a fan of horror from an early age. I remember the first time I saw a horror movie. I was scared so badly it took 2 full weeks before I could sleep peacefully. Even though a lot of stuff terrified me as a child, I still loved the thrill. My parents used to take me through haunted houses and hayrides every October. But what really instilled a love for the holiday was the candy. I was always that kid who would venture far beyond my parental parameters in search of the better candy. The day of Halloween, friends would bombard me with rumors of which houses are giving out the king-size candy bars, chips, and other high-quality sweets. Usually, when I was told about this, I would realize that those rumored houses were always at the edge of town, far beyond my 2-block radius that I was allowed to tread. However, that rarely stopped me. I would trek long into the night and not return until late in the evening. As I grew older, the distance became that much greater. I wasn't the only one staying out that extra hour, or traveling an extra block to fatten my pillowcase. I would often see a few other kids in groups traveling all over, and I would hide behind trees whenever I'd spy a group of teenagers on bikes. You may think that stuff only happens in movies, but you'd be wrong. I've had my candy stolen from me twice, the 2 worst Halloweens of my childhood. Once I grew out of my candy hunting phase and began focusing solely on my hormones, my love for Halloween diminished, but never disappeared. Through my teenage years, I would help my mother in decorating the house, then head off to a Halloween party some kids from school was usually throwing. After high school, Halloween drifted further from my mind as work consumed the rest of my time. Working on Halloween was the absolute worst. All the decorations in the store and the atmosphere of fun soon to be had was a constant reminder of how crappy adulthood really was. I did receive a second wind, as it were, when I turned 21, when my desire to trick-or-treat was supplanted by my desire to bar hop with friends, enjoying costume contests and the drunken antics that ensued. I had lived in an apartment at the time, and I always felt bad for the children who lived in apartments as well. Most of the time, the people living in the apartments rarely gave out candy, so the kids either had to venture far out on their own, or have their parents bring them to a neighborhood. Regardless, when I lived there, I always kept a bowl of candy ready on the off chance someone happened to knock on my door. Those knocks never came, of course, and I would always end up devouring the lot of candy on my own in front of the TV, with my stomach cursing me in the morning. After a few years living in the apartment, I made a vow that if I ever bought a house, I would go all out. I would deck the house from top to bottom in decorations, fog machines, and I would have the best candy in the entire neighborhood. It just so happens that when I turned 30, I had worked pretty hard and managed to save up enough money to put a down payment on a house of my very own. The house was extremely small, mind you, and sat on the back edge of a neighborhood with a dead end, with the almost non-existent backyard bordering a small forest. I say forest, but it was one of those suburban forests where they look super dense at night, but in the daytime you can see clear through the other side. The first few nights after I bought the house, I noticed that the streetlights didn't really extend all the way to my house. The dim edge of light barely reached my driveway, thus encasing the rest of my house entirely in darkness. I suppose if you're looking at it just right, the house would appear to be a place where a deranged killer would live. But I digress. The year after I bought the house, I might have gone a bit overboard. I had everything from an inflatable ghost to a horrifying scarecrow to eerie lights plastered all over the place. I was so excited to spend my first Halloween watching old horror flicks and handing out candy. Though, oddly enough, I hardly got any trick-or-treaters. The house I had bought had been on the market for quite some time, so I attributed the lack of kids to that. They probably had been accustomed to thinking that my house never had anything good. When I was a kid, heading towards the house at a dead end rarely paid off, so I avoided them to save some time. It wasn't until much later in the evening did I receive a knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 children, maybe 9 or 10 years old, shouted "trick or treat" at the top of their lungs. I was so happy to have my first trick-or-treaters that I gave them each 3 king-size Snickers bars. Their faces lit up immediately as they grinned to one another before thanking me and running off. I repeated the gesture for a couple more times before it was eventually time to turn out the lights. After wandering around my yard for a moment, switching off the plethora of glowing orange light bulbs, I finally headed inside. It was around 11:30 at night when I plopped into my chair to finish the third movie I had started that night. Upon sitting down, I heard the softest of taps at my door. At first, I thought it must have been the TV, but as I waited, listening more intently, I heard the taps once again. It almost sounded like someone unsure if I was still awake or not. So I rose from my chair, grabbed what remained of my candy bowl, and made my way towards the door. In a quick, fluid motion, I grabbed the doorknob and pulled the door open. There was no one there. I scratched the top of my head a bit perplexed before taking a half step outside and looking around my darkened yard. Even though I had powered down the lights and fog machines, the fog still lingered across my lawn. I strained my eyes, but I was unable to see anyone. Thinking I was too late and that the kids must have moved on at that point, I headed back inside. As soon as I shut my door, I heard that same tap directly on the other side. I froze. I had my back to the door and something in my soul was screaming at me not to turn around. I knew the feeling I had was unwarranted. But what unnerved me was the fact that a second before, I was standing on the porch without a soul in sight. Slowly, I turned to face the door. Every primal instinct in my body screamed not to open it. Somehow, I managed to drum up enough adrenaline in my body to grip the doorknob and open it once again. Once again, there was no one on the other side. As I stood there, I noticed that the nearby streetlight had turned itself off, so now my entire house was now bathed in blackness. I scanned my yard carefully, trying not to pay any mind to the candy bowl that rattled nervously in my hand. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the fog before it faded into darkness. I stepped backwards through the threshold of my doorway and quickly shut and locked the door. As soon as the deadbolt latched, it sounded as if someone had slammed their hands on the other side of the door. The blow was so powerful, I could hear the wood groan as it tried to resist. The unexpected shock sent me falling to the floor. The banging on my door only happened 3 times before everything became still and silent. A part of my mind attempted to rationalize this as some teenage punks trying to scare the crap out of me, similar to Ding Dong Ditch. That was until I heard a new sound coming from directly on the other side of the door. Growling. It may sound strange, but the growling didn't sound like a beast or an animal. It sounded human, as if a zombie were on the other side of my door. Maybe some kid dressed as a zombie wanted to commit to his costume a little too much. I managed to pull myself to my feet and make my way to my phone and called the cops. This might have been overkill, but I wasn't taking any chances. The police informed me that since it was Halloween, it might take a few minutes to make it out to me, but that they would send a squad car right over. During this time, I heard no sound, no noise whatsoever from outside my house. As I sat there staring at the door, I kept getting this feeling like something was watching me. A few minutes passed by and there was a knock at the door. I paused for a moment before I heard, "Police, we're here about the distress call." Slowly, I opened the door and stared at the officer before my gaze drifted to my now illuminated front yard from the police car. All of my decorations had been destroyed. My inflatable ghost was torn to pieces and strewn about my lawn. My lights had been ripped off my house, and one of my fog machines appeared to have been partially crushed. But that wasn't even the worst of it. I then saw the other side of my door. The paint was torn away from the places where the impact sounded from. My doormat was completely shredded. I was unsure how all of this could have been possible in such a short amount of time. But what really confused me was that I had only heard knocking. Doing this type of damage to someone's decorations should have caused a big ruckus. But I heard nothing between the knocks and the police showing up. I informed the officer about what I had experienced, and he was just as confused as I was. He searched the entire area only to come up empty-handed, of course, and then told me that he would be in the area all night. After telling me to file a formal report at the police station in the morning, he left. Even though I didn't hear a single noise the rest of the night, I still didn't go to sleep. I'm not sure who or what did this to me, but I haven't given out candy since then, nor have I decorated my house. Every Halloween, I lock down my entire house. Then I go to stay at one of my friend's house for the night. This year, I'm currently staying with a friend of mine who lives in an apartment complex. He tells me he never gets any trick-or-treaters, so we don't have to worry about anything. But it's 11:30 at night right now, and my friend and I just heard a faint knocking coming from his door. And I don't think either of us are going to answer it tonight.